Welcome everyone to our Quilts Equals Art Equals Quilts Artist Talks. I am Davana Robedee, the Program Director here at the Schweinfurth Art Center, and I am joined by Irene Roderick, who has 2 quilts in our exhibition. And if you want to come see those quilts in person, you can come by until January 9th. And hello, Irene. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Davana, it's an honor to be invited to talk to you today.
Yeah, so can you just tell me a little bit about the works that are in the show?
It's interesting because the 2 works that are in the show are from completely different series. They're both done probably within an 8-month time period during the pandemic, but I kind of worked through a lot of work during those times of isolation. And so the first one is Viola da Gamba, and I work entirely improvisationally. And so I will just start one day and take a piece of fabric that's sitting around and put it on the wall. And what I had done with Viola is I had been working on quilts that were based on really long, thin curves cut out of fabric that I had dyed in grays and kind of an ombre effect, and to make it look like they were kind of charcoal drawings. Well, when I do those big curves, I cut them from big solid pieces of fabric because I want the grains to match. And so I had all of these pieces just left over that were these, the outlines of these curves in these pieces. And I just took one and stuck it in the middle of the wall. And I went, oh, that's fun. And I loved the way it kind of showed off the hand-dyed fabric, kind of the nuances of what it can do. And it kind of created a completely different feel of what I had been working on. And I just started working with that. And so my process is I put a piece on the, something on the wall, and then I just sit back and I look at it and I decide what to do next. And then I'll put another piece on the wall, and I'll just keep doing that until it's completely a quilt. And then I sew it together after that. And that's pretty much where that quilt came from. And I was showing it to a friend one day, and she went, looks like a Viola da Gamba. And I'm just, what is that? And she said, look it up. So I did. And of course, it's an Italian string instrument that's similar to more like a cello, I think, for us. And so I thought that was a perfect name, because when you sit back and look at it, it does very much look like a stringed instrument of that sort. And then the other one, which is Celebration of Indigo, is part of another series that I got into as the pandemic became more isolating. I lived alone in a tiny house. My groceries were being delivered. I was teaching on Zoom, but I had no contact with real people. My size people. Everybody was about 2 inches tall. And so I started doing a series that ended up looking like figures, kind of like friends. It seemed like when I look back on it, I was making people and entities to live in my space with me that I could share my experiences with. And so Celebration of Indigo is pretty much 3 figures all together that are standing there and talking to me. And it is also completely improv, except for the big circles at the top. I was making these circles of different colors, and I was really playing with color relationships in those. And I would just make a quadrant at a time. And then I just started playing with those on the wall, putting them together. Loved the way they were acting with each other. And then the next thing I know, I've put big slabs of fabric and I'm making them into characters and playing with them and having the best time. And that's pretty much how those things came to be.
Yeah. So I know what improv is, and I know a lot of our quilters know what improv is, but some people who follow us, the Schweinfurth, might not understand exactly what improv is. So can you explain a little bit about what you mean when you say improv?
Yes, basically improv it means working without a pattern. And there are many, many, many different ways to do improv, especially in the art world and in the quilt world as well. My way of making, of doing improv quilts is, like I was saying, starting in the middle of my design wall with one single piece of fabric. It can be a scrap off the floor. It can be something on my cutting board. It can be a brand new color that I just got in the mail. I'll cut a piece off and I start there. And without a pattern, without any preconception, without any kind of idea of what I'm going to make, I just start putting things on the wall improvisationally, one piece at a time, making them work together. I don't move them once I put them up there. I just keep adding until it all works as a composition. And it's very fluid and it's completely intuitive. What I love about it is how creative it is and how it actually keeps me engaged, kind of at every single moment of creating a piece. It's a constant stepping back and assessing and then figuring out what I want to do next. And so it's, and what's interesting is that, and what I've discovered is when I look back, I realize that I have really tapped into whatever was going on in my life at that period of time. And I love looking back and go, oh, that was when, this happened, or that was when this was on the news. And I realized that everything that I experience comes out in my piece in some way. And so, it's basically just a way of working intuitively and fluidly without a preconception or a pattern.
Yeah, it's a little like allowing your unconscious mind to sort of flow, and then afterwards you start to make connections about what that was when you begin to look at the results.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly.
There's a lot of movement in your pieces, and I think even some of yours talk about dance, and I think it has to do with some of the skinny lines and your curves. But can you talk a little bit about like why? Because I know some improv quilters have somewhat of a grid-like structure occasionally, and yours completely demolishes that. Can you talk a little bit about the movement and why that's important to you?
It's because I come from a painting background. I am not a quilter. I have never been a quilter. I didn't ever know anything about quilting growing up. My mother didn't quilt. My grandmothers didn't quilt. I was always a painter. And so I always made large scale paintings. And so in a lot of ways, the movement in my pieces, I think, comes from spending 65 years painting with a paintbrush and kind of the motion and drawing. I love drawing. Drawing is one of my favorite things. And so, and I think that I really try to create a lot of drawing in my quilts, as more than anything else. But it's that arm movement, I think, that creates, that I've used for all my life, that creates these kind of this sense of movement. And I love, like in the quilt behind me, which is I love it when they don't match up. I love it when they're just crazy. The idea of having something perfectly straight or perfectly lined up is just not interesting to me. I like all those little nuances of movement. And the dancing idea basically came more from my process than the quilts. Mm-hmm. And so I discovered when I first had to define what I was doing to put together a workshop, that I moved from the design board to the cutting table to the sewing machine to the iron and back all day long. And I'm listening to music. I'm really dancing all day. I don't sit down much. And so it was more the process. But then I also realized that I really do think it comes from my painting background and my arms, used to kind of making these long lines. And it is important. I mean, I think that without movement, things get boring.
Yeah, you say in your artist statement that you came to quilting as a utilitarian painting. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I painted for all my life. I started painting when I was 10. And I have a master's degree that I got in painting when I was 50. So I went back to school and got a degree, a master's degree in painting. And I've been always painting, and I've painted everything. I've painted walls and murals, and I've made furniture and painted it, and I've painted clothes and umbrellas and tennis shoes and needlepoint designs. And it's just like, I love the idea of things that are functional, but are also fine art. But I had kind of had it with fine art paintings. I have a bunch of them out in the carport that are rolled up that are going to sit there forever. And I love the idea of being able to make something similar that is actually functional, that will keep you warm. And last year, during our big freeze that we had here for a week, and all the power went out and everybody was freezing to death, it was amazing how so many of these quilts ended up over doors, over windows, on floors, keeping people warm. And I love that they have a function as well as can be considered fine art.
One thing I was thinking about and looking at the piece behind you is that what non-quilters or people who aren't familiar with some of the process don't realize is that your rotary cutting tool, which I'm assuming that's what you use, when you're at your cutting board making these lines, is sort of like drawing, except you're drawing with scissors. And, what do you think about approaching drawing as like a reductive process?
What do you mean a reductive process?
Like you're cutting, instead of making the line, you're like removing the line and then adding it.
I don't think about them in the same terms at all. To me, drawing is done with with a drawing medium. And to me, because quilting, the other thing, part is being functional, is that it has to be pieced. And so to me, it's about the piecing in a quilt, creating a line rather than drawing a line with a drawing implement. So I did just come from a Nancy Crow workshop, and she very much talks about cutting, and that line is a line that you are cutting. And it doesn't like get in my head in the same way. To me, I'm cutting out pieces that I'm going to sew together to create that line.
Wow. Yeah, because in my mind, I see it as reductive, but it seems like you see it as additive, but it produces the same result either way. And I feel like quilting with lines is almost like removing the ability to make a direct mark. It's like almost delaying that mark somehow.
Well, and I think on Viola da Gama, it's got some drawing on it. I actually got some pens. I was playing a lot with mark making during the pandemic, early days of the pandemic, when you kept hearing we're all in this together. And so I was going, well, what else do we all do? And mark making is historically, since the beginning of time, is something that we do. And so I was doing that. But it's so funny, I think, because I started as a painter and drawing, that I see the two as completely different crafts, methods, techniques. I do not combine them in my head in any way. It's interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. One thing I wanted to go back to with the two quilts that are in the show, well, specifically the celebration of Indigo, are you hand dyeing your Indigo, or are you, where is your interest in that color?
I started dyeing Indigo a few years ago. A friend of mine came up to me at a guild meeting and said, how would you feel about doing Indigo? I went, sure. And so we actually put together an organic henna indigo vat in my kitchen, and we started playing. We used books, we used the internet, and we kind of really learned how to do indigo dyeing. It's fascinating. It's like sourdough bread. It's living, you feed it every day, you stir it, you talk to it, you wrap it in blankets. And I got fascinated with the whole idea. And of course, the color is just exquisite. And so I was doing a lot of indigo dyeing for a long time. And then, of course, after 2 years, the vat kind of just, died out on us. And we haven't started a new one. A lot of the fabrics in that quilt are basically done with Procyon dyes in an indigo color. I do kind of dye fabric like I paint. I will lay it out flat. I will use foam brushes. I will mix different colors of dyes and I will combine them to get the effect I want. But I mean, there's something about the history. I just finished listening to the Indigo Girl. Is it the Indigo Girl? Yesterday afternoon, about, her, the first person to grow indigo in South Carolina. And there's something about the history of the process and how it's universally made all over the world and how labor intensive it is and how it plays into so much of our history that just fascinates me, that other dyes don't do.
Right. Right. And so do you dye all of your fabrics, or you do some and choose which colors you need and fill in there, or you use commercial fabrics as well?
I use commercial fabrics as well. I do both. Like this one behind me is all commercial. I love Procyon dyes in that I can manipulate them, but I love the softness of natural dyes. And so I love both. When I'm dyeing fabric, I'm normally dyeing it for a particular reason. So I was taking a class from a dyer here in town, Malka Dabrowski, and we were doing that ombre, 12 different values of fabrics. And so I had a bunch of those from class. And every time I take a class, I use what I make in class in my quilts, because why not? And so I was really having fun playing with making and painting these big pieces of fabric and then figuring out how I could make them work in my work. And so, I mean, I just add them to my stash as I make them. A lot of times too, I'll make extra, I'll stick it in there. And then when I'm looking for a color I want, I just pull it out and use it. So I use them indiscriminately with commercial fabrics.
Yeah. Yeah, I love hand dyed fabrics, and I love commercial fabrics too. I love fabric, but yeah. I always understand how hard it is to find a specific color that you need, and that's like your palette. So you have to create it for yourself.
Yeah, because I've always said I did color pencil drawings for years too. When the kids were little and kept eating my paints, I went to color pencils, and you can have a box of 132 color pencils and never have the color you need. And it's kind of the same with fabrics. There's a very particular color you've got in your head and you have to make it. I also have noticed that a lot of people who use hand-dyed fabrics, especially, Procyon fiber reactive dyes, those colors glow in a way that commercial fabrics don't. And a lot of commercial fabrics, I think they're really high quality, but they're not using as much dye as I will use and other people will use when they're dyeing at home. And so to see some colors in a quilt show that just kind of glow off the wall, you always know that's going to be a hand dyed. And so I have been making I have been making some of the brighter colors in the last 2 weeks to have and put in my stash, just because I really want that glow in some pieces that I'm going to be doing coming up.
Yeah. And so you have several different bodies of work. And I know that you work intuitively, but you were talking about that you were placing meaning on these works sort of after the fact. Mm-hmm. Is that meaning after the fact important that the viewer know to you, or is it something you hold to yourself as part of your interaction with the quilt? Where does meaning come into this for you? Or if it doesn't matter at all,
it doesn't matter to me at all. I don't want to lead the viewer into thinking anything. I love for myself to appreciate art the way I want to see it and the way it means to me. I can't go back and understand where, an impressionist head was, or, Duchamp's head was in that period of time. And, I don't want to. I want to experience art one-on-one and what it means to me at my moment in time. I just find it interesting. Because I don't make, overtly political work, which a lot of people do, and it's amazing. I cannot do that, But I find that when I look back on what I've made, that it is pretty much always can be considered political in a way. But I don't want to lead the viewer into thinking that it meant any particular thing to me at any particular time. To me, it's just interesting, to go, oh, well, that's what you were doing, and that's where your head was, and that's why you did that whole series, because I don't ever know when I'm making them.
Yeah. It's, you trust the process completely, and it's a product of the process.
Right. I think was it Rosalie Dace, who is a quilter from South Africa, and she teaches a lot, and she says something about what goes in your head comes out your fingers, and she's right about that. Whatever you're thinking and experiencing will come out in your work.
Yeah. I find your work to be very playful, and well, I mentioned the dance, but also some of your color choices seem to be really just bold and bright and fun, and there's these moments in the work that give good vibes, I guess.
That's important to me. Mm-hmm. I love things with a sense of humor in them, whether it's a movie or a TV show or a piece of art. My sisters and I, many, many, many years ago, were going through Soho, going from show to show to show, and at the end of the day, we said, I remember going, what was your favorite? And we realized the ones that we all loved the best were the ones that were really funny, or that hit us in that kind of way. We weren't drawn to something that was heavy or dark or deep. We wanted kind of the more frivolous or the more upbeat or the more, and I want that in my work. I want it to be humorous. I want it to be uplifting and light. I don't want it to be heavy and too thoughtful. I was married to a philosophy professor for years, and it's important to me to have things that are more light and yeah.
All right. Well, is there anything that is important to your work that I haven't hit upon or I haven't asked you about yet?
I think what's most important to me, and is, I painted for all those thousands of years. It seems like thousands at this point. And I never, ever kind of realized this kind of freedom of creativity until I started working with fabric. And it has changed the way I think about what I make and about myself, to know that I finally kind of reached this place where I can play and I can create and I can have fun, and it doesn't have to be serious and it doesn't have to be heavy. Because until you can get to that point, like you were saying earlier, where it's all intuitive and you're just in the flow, there is nothing more exciting than being in that flow. And that flow never was, I was never able to reach that until I started kind of playing with fabric and quilting. And to that end, I will always be indebted to this process.
That's beautiful. Well, guys, if you want to learn more about Irene's work, you can visit her website and be sure to come in before January 9th to see the exhibit. Thank you so much, Irene.
Thank you for inviting me.